It was, of course, in Chekhov that you really first established yourself as an actor, wasn't it?
Well, I think it was the first part, that the part of Trofimov and the Cherry Orchard was the first time I ever went on the stage and felt perhaps I could act. Before that, I felt I could exhibit myself to some extent, and I rather enjoyed the business of going to the theatre and walking about on the stage, and something to do with my instincts told me that I wanted to have something to do with the theatre. But really I wanted to design scenery, and I wanted to have something to do with the lighting and the movement of plays, which is what I admired most when I was a boy. And I think this really meant that I wanted to be a director, which since I've had the luck to become, as well as an actor. Acting to me is a responsibility and a great difficulty, whereas the feeling of work in the theatre has always been the easiest and most happy part of my life.
But is it fair to say that your attitude to the theatre and your persona as an actor has always been a romantic one?
I suppose it is true that. I always used it as an escape, I think. I'm a terrible escapist in life. And to go to a theatre and shut myself up in a dressing room and come out as somebody else and live a mimic life does give me pleasure, and I suppose always has done. I suppose all children dress up and play games, but my brothers and sister and I were tremendously theatrically minded in that way in our nursery days and in our school days even. I was always living in some sort of fantasy world.
Was the strong Teddy influence in your family, did it make it certain, really, that you were bound to be something to do with the theatre?
I suppose it must have been. I was enormously englamoured by my family, particularly the ones who were acting still when I was a boy. And my parents didn't encourage this very much, although they were naturally very proud of it too. My mother was the theatrical one because she was a Terry, but my father, who was partly Polish, had a curious mixture of practical middle-class English realism mixed with a certain romantic panache.
How did you prepare for your stage work in the theatre?
I went to 2 dramatic schools, and my cousin Phyllis Nielsen Terry gave me a job as assistant stage manager and understudy in a tour she was doing of a play she'd played in London, and we did a 18 or 20 weeks tour of all the provincial cities. But one of the actors said, you ought to really go to one of the dramatic schools. And I went, before this I had been at Lady Benson's school for about a year, and after I came back from that first tour, I went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art School, and I was there for about a year, I think, also. And from that, Nigel Playfair gave me a job in the insect play, in which I was terribly bad. And it was rather wonderful to be with men like Playfair and J.B. Fagan, who I afterwards worked with at Oxford, because they were wonderful talent spotters. And at that time, I know I must have been very, very clumsy and conceited and silly and vain. And they kind of made one feel one had something, although they didn't spoil one. They didn't make you feel absolutely hopeless and wretched.
The time you were with J.B. Fagan was at the Oxford Playhouse, wasn't it?
That's right. It was about,
in repertory.
Yes, we did. I was there about 3 terms, and we did about 8 plays a term. I suppose I played about 16 parts.
After Oxford, what?
After Oxford, then I got a job. I was very lucky because I played the piano a bit by ear. And this, by chance, got me the opportunity of understudying Noel Coward in The Vortex. And he was very nice to me. And finally, he was directing a review at Manchester for Cochrane, and I went on and played one night and did rather well, so they said, and so much so that when he left the play they kept it on another month and I played his part. And soon after that I again followed him in The Constant Nymph, which was an enormous commercial success in 1926. That was the first time I played a leading part really in the West End, except for that month in The Vortex.
How did you react to the business of a long run in the West End?
Well, I found it terribly irksome, and The Constant Nymph was extremely tiring, and I had a very bad time because the company didn't like me very much. They resented Noel leaving, and I wasn't very happy with the direction that I got, such as it was. But the play was an enormous success, and I learnt the hard way to carry this very long and exhausting part for more than a year, and afterwards for quite a long tour. I thought, well, I must go back to Oxford or do something and do some interesting work, and I began to play in a lot of Sunday shows, and I also played in some very bad plays in the West End, for which I was rather well paid, thrillers and terrible comedies and things, which were not a success, but filled the time up.
Did you find it a depressing period, or was this...
Well, of course, I was the leading man in those plays, which was a new experience for me. I was getting good billing and good salary, and so I thought, oh, perhaps then it's just acting is to just be in work and do things.
Were there any actors or actresses at that particular period in your career that influenced you particularly, or that you
Well, when I was going to the
admired?
Old Vic, I was working with Edith Evans in a play called The Lady with the Lamp, in which Leslie Banks had created the part, and I was asked to come in because he left the cast about 3 or 4 weeks before it ended. Gwen Franken Davis, who had been extremely kind to me before that, was also in the play and was a great friend of Dame Edith's. And so, through those two women, I was very happy in this play. Gwen had been my first Juliet. I had played Romeo with her at the Regent Theatre in 1923 and made a frightful mess of it.
Looking back, is it possible for you to decide why you made such a mess of that Romeo?
Well, I had the most terrible clothes to begin with, and the most wicked wig, because I was only 19, and I suppose I can't have been so hideous as all that. But I didn't know how to move. I think I spoke not badly, but we had a very, very drastic director. But I just wasn't ready, and I didn't know how to select what I wanted to do or really put over emotion. I just indulged in my own emotions and imagined that was acting, and I only learnt long afterwards that you can't indulge, although you may indulge your emotions in imagining a part, you mustn't allow them free rein until you have selected exactly what you want to show the audience and how much you must show it while you're doing it.
Is this something that you learned perhaps with Harcourt Williams at the Vic?
I don't think I learned it till a very few years ago, really. I know Komisarjevsky used to tell me to relax, and I thought relaxing was something that you had nothing to do with the stage. When I was on the stage, I felt it was my duty to do something and give something and be something. And through imagination, intense imagination and tremendous emotional desire, I did create a certain effect, but it was always very tense. And I think people found me very artificial and very overstrung. It was, of course, very helpful in parts like Richard II and Hamlet to have this emotional tension, but I exhausted myself most terribly. I used to be absolutely whacked playing these very big classical parts and trying to live every moment of them. I couldn't find any places. It didn't occur to me that there are places where you really must do nothing. And it was very fascinating to me last year rehearsing Richard Burton in Hamlet in New York, which I directed, because I said to him, well, this is going to be your Hamlet, you know. I'm not going to try and give you mine, but perhaps I can help you a bit with the technical side of it. And he said after the first week or two, he said, the thing which is so marvelous that I've got from you is you tell me when to save myself. I'm not exhausted at the end of this scene or that scene, which used to kill me when I played the part of the Vic. And I said, well, that's all I've learned over all these years. Of course, when I was first playing things like Musical Chairs and The Constant Nymph and The Vortex, these neurotic young men were very fashionable in the 20s. And I came in rather on the crest of the wave with the sort of parts that were written for those kind of boys who were meant to be very intense and highly strung. And there was enough of my own personality that jumped with that to allow me to give some effective performances, I think, in those days. But I think if I saw them now, I would be horrified at the amount of energy and violence I put into things. And I remember when I first worked with Laurence Olivier in Romeo and Juliet, and we alternated the parts of Mercutio and Romeo, and I was directing. And I bullied him a great deal about his verse speaking, which he admitted himself he wasn't happy about. I was rather showy about mine and fancied myself very much as a verse speaker, and I think became very mannered in consequence. But I was so jealous because when he played Romeo, he used tremendous energy, but he knew just how to cope with it, select it. And also when he did things which I tried to do in the same part. I remember Ralph Richardson, who I had made great friends with meanwhile, saying to me, but you see, when Larry leans against the balcony, the whole balcony scene is, the way he leans against the balcony, looks up, is the whole scene immediately, because he has this wonderful plastique which is absolutely unself-conscious, like a lithe young panther or something. And I would been draping myself around the stage for weeks, thinking myself very romantic as Romeo. I was rather baffled and dismayed to find I couldn't make the same effect at all.
It was Richard II, I suppose, that became one of the great landmarks in your early career.
It was for me, because I'd loved this play when I saw it with Ernest Milton at the Old Vic. and then I was allowed to play it. Because when I went to the Old Vic to live in Bury, she was a very canny old lady, and she was very sort of landladyish and said, oh, well, a few parts going. You might, of course, we might give you Hamlet, but you see, we've got Giles Isham in the company and 2 or 3 other good actors. We can't promise anything. So I rather jumped at the part she offered, and Richard II was one of them, which really decided me to go. The extraordinary thing, looking back now, is to think how quickly one seemed to gobble up these plays, because we did 8 or 9 plays a season in 2 seasons, and I played, I suppose, about 15 big leading Shakespeare parts, and I learnt them, rehearsed them, and played them with about 3 weeks rehearsal. Then we gave about 9 or 12 performances only, so that one really, it was a marvelous, Bosch shot at all these great parts. And in certain moments of Macbeth and Lear and Hamlet and Richard II, I know I played them better then than I ever played them afterwards, when I'd had time to study them and really rehearse them properly. Because one sort of played it like charades. You got an idea of the character and you just buzzed on, had to do it.
Many people seem to think that when you first played Richard II, that this interpretation was the spearhead of a new kind of acting. Do you think there was any truth in that?
No, I think it was more the result of an old kind of acting,
In
what
what
I've
way?
heard now. Well, I think that I did inherit from Terry's and from the, what I call the panache actors that I admired so much in my youth, a certain gift of projection and unreal kind of romantic acting, which I did with so much conviction for myself that I did manage to convince the audience. But now, hearing it again, it sounds to me very voice conscious, and I'm rather ashamed to think that I was so contented with that kind of acting, because I don't really believe it has the truth in it that I would like, except, of course, that in Richard II, which is a very artificial part, and a man who was meant to be studying himself and indulging in his own sorrows, it may have been more appropriate.
It was during that season at the Old Vic under Harcourt Williams that you played Hamlet for the first time, wasn't
Yes.
it? Was this a particularly arduous thing to do for somebody who was playing in all the plays in the repertoire?
It was very
during that
arduous because we
particular time?
played the entirety without any cuts at all for several performances. Then we played a cut version. Then we went back to the entirety. Then we moved to the Queen's Theatre and did another cut version. So that we were always learning new bits. And curiously enough, I found the entirety less tiring because the other parts are longer and Hamlet has a few more rests. And the King's part, which is usually rather stringently cut, is given much more chance. And he makes, I think, a more worthy opponent to Hamlet, which I always feel he should be, when his part is left longer in the play.
Did you have any conscious model for when you were studying the part for the first time?
No, I didn't. I thought I had. I thought I would copy all the actors I'd ever seen in turn. And I'd by then seen about a dozen or 15 Hamlets. And of course Irving was my god, although I'd never seen him. I just read about him being Ellen Terry's partner, and the whole idea of this magnetic, strange man who I knew I could never be anything like somehow appealed to me more than any other past actor that I'd ever read about. But I didn't try to copy. I only sort of took note of all the things he'd done and looked at the pictures of him and so on. But when it came to the Vic, the play moved so fast and there was so much of it that I suddenly felt, well, I've just got to be myself. And I really played absolutely straight as far as I could. But, of course, I was fortunate in that, except for at Oxford, it had never been allowed to be played by a very young actor until I played it. It was the kind of prize that an actor, when he went into management at the age of 40 or 50, allowed himself, H.B. Irving or Benton or whoever it was. I mean, I don't think anybody had ever played it under 35. And I think it made people realize the tragedy of the beginning of the play in a way that an older man can never achieve it. When I played it when I was 40, in 1944, the last time, I was very well aware that with the help of various directors whom I'd worked with and actors whom I'd worked with, I knew more about the part and had much more better staying power and perhaps more selectivity. But I didn't think I could contrive the opening of the play in the way that it had come to me when I was absolutely fresh, because I really felt it then. And I was young, and so I naturally put it over in the right way. But to imitate that 15 years later, I felt was very false, and it always disturbed me that I was putting on my young voice and face and everything for the beginning of the play. If you can only keep your vitality and keep your balance between the old and the new, then you can still go on being of some use to your art and your craft. And if not, I think you ought to stop, probably. And I'd be quite prepared to play less important parts in the next 10 or 15 years, if I can find things that I really feel I can do in my own way, perhaps better than anybody else. That's what I would like to find.
Is there anything that you've not accomplished in your life in the theatre that you would most dearly love to have done?
Well, I would love to have done something with Othello. That was a great disaster and a great sorrow to me. And I don't think I'd ever dare to risk it again, especially after the enormous success and the wonderful performance of Olivier last year. Also, his Macbeth was so good that it was a part I rather fancied and had thought perhaps to play again one day, but I feel he was too good in it for me to compete. But there aren't many parts. There's been talk sometimes of my playing Malvolio, which I'm not awfully keen about. I did play Henry IV in the Falstaff things for Orson Welles on the screen, so I feel I've done that and won't have to do it in the theatre. And there aren't very many other parts that I really lust after. I would love to do Prospero, perhaps as a film, but I would always love to play Prospero or Lear because I think they're beautiful parts. Unfortunately, they're parts you can still play when you're an old man. So I feel there's a put away in reserve perhaps for another day.
But how about the field of directing?
Well, directing I love, and I will always do it if I really like the play. I've always rather longed to direct a successful musical, not only because it's very profitable, because it must be great fun if you get the right thing. But I know from all one sees and hears what an arduous and difficult job it is, and unless I could find exactly the script that I felt I could do justice to, I wouldn't take it on.
You have no longer any thoughts about having permanent companies or anything of this
Not
kind?
really, no. I have a feeling that if I've got another 10 or 15 years of career, I would like to feel that I can play sometimes in London, sometimes in New York, perhaps do a film in Hollywood or on a location in Europe somewhere, perhaps do the Shakespeare recital a few times in the countries I haven't done it, like Japan and Turkey and Greece, and to feel that I was free to travel and enjoy a certain amount of spare time. I do think that one's pioneering days have been so full. I've done so many things for so long, and I've been so lucky, both in the people I've worked with and in the work I've done, that I don't really feel I want to fling myself into violent action again to that extent. I don't think I'd be able to live up to it. And so, without any feeling that I want to retire or slacken off too much, I would just like to feel I was going to have a varied and interesting time and be, as Ellen Terry used to say, a useful actor for the rest of my career.